The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft clinking of dishes under a steady stream of water. Irina stood hunched over the sink, her back slightly bent from years of hard work. The flickering fluorescent bulb above her cast a pale light over the room, making the bruises on her arms appear even darker. Each movement of her hands was slow, deliberate, not just from exhaustion, but from pain. The porcelain plates, though clean, had been washed twice already. She wasn't washing dishes anymore, she was distracting herself, holding back the tears that kept threatening to spill. Behind her, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Irina's spine stiffened, her knuckles whitening around the sponge. She didn't need to turn around to know it was her daughter, Alina. The same daughter she had once cradled in her arms, sang lullabies to, comforted during storms. That daughter was no longer gentle. The door burst open with a loud creak. Irina barely flinched, she had learned not to. Alina's voice was sharp, filled with contempt. "You didn't pay the electricity bill again, did you? God, you're useless," she shouted, her words like knives. Irina didn't answer. She knew from experience that silence was safer. Alina stormed across the room, grabbing a glass off the table and hurling it at the wall. It shattered, pieces flying. Irina's hands trembled as she set down a dish. Her eyes remained on the soapy water, as if the chaos behind her didn't exist. But inside, her heart pounded. Every time Alina raised her voice, it brought a wave of fear that tonight might be another night she'd end up bruised or worse. Still, Irina said nothing. She didn't cry out, didn't defend herself. Just one tear slipped from her eye, falling silently into the sink. She had no strength left for confrontation. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. The grocery store was small, tucked between a pharmacy and a bakery that always smelled of fresh bread. Irina entered quietly, her faded coat clutched tightly around her thin frame. The cold outside had left a red flush on her cheeks, but it didn't hide the yellowing bruise just under her left eye. She kept her head down, scanning the shelves with practiced swiftness, moving like a shadow between the aisles. She picked up a loaf of stale bread, then hesitated before grabbing a carton of milk. Prices had gone up again, and she only had a few crumpled bills in her coat pocket. Every item was a calculation. Every step in public was a risk, someone might notice. Two women stood by the vegetable section, chatting. Their voices were low, but Irina caught snatches of their conversation as she passed. "That's her, right? The one whose daughter screams at her on the balcony, every week." The other woman nodded, casting a sideways glance. "Yes. Poor thing. Or maybe she deserves it, who knows what goes on behind closed doors." Irina's grip on her bag tightened. Her hands began to tremble, but she didn't look at them. She just kept walking, staring at the labels on canned goods like they mattered. Her chest felt heavy, not just from shame, but from the weight of being watched, judged, misunderstood. At the checkout counter, she placed her items slowly, avoiding the cashier's eyes. The young woman behind the register looked nervous, almost guilty, as if she too had heard the whispers. "That'll be $312, the cashier said softly. Irina fumbled for her money, embarrassed by how long it took her to unfold the bills. She exited the store quickly, heart pounding. Outside, the wind hit her face like punishment. She stood for a moment, staring down the street toward home. Her bruises weren't just on her body, they lived in her silence, in the way people looked through her. Irina didn't cry. Not here. She had learned how to hold her pain. How to fold it neatly inside, like a letter never sent. The house was quiet in the early afternoon, the kind of stillness that only comes after heartbreak. Irina sat in her worn-out armchair by the window, a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. Outside, children played in the alley, their laughter echoing faintly through the thin glass. The sound stirred something deep inside her, and without meaning to, her mind drifted back to a different time, one where the air in her home wasn't heavy with tension. She remembered Alina as a little girl. Her soft curls bouncing as she ran barefoot through the hallway, giggling, a doll clutched tightly in her tiny hands. "Mama, look, she has a dress just like mine." Irina had smiled, kneeling down to kiss her daughter's forehead. Back then, their days were filled with warmth. The kitchen had been a place of joy, the smell of cinnamon and fresh dough wafting through the air as they baked together. Alina had stood on a stool beside her, flour dusting her cheeks, her laughter ringing out like music. "Don't burn the cookies again, Mama." she'd tease, her voice innocent and playful. Irina closed her eyes. The memories came sharper now, the bedtime stories, the songs they'd sing as Alina curled up under her blanket, the way she'd reach for her mother's hand when thunder scared her at night. "I'm not afraid when you're with me," she used to whisper. And Irina had believed that their bond would never break. But life had shifted. Time passed. Poverty crept in like a slow flood. Alina grew older, and the innocence in her eyes faded. The laughter turned into shouting, the sweetness into bitterness. Irina tried to hold on, to protect her daughter from the cruelty of the world, but in doing so, she may have shielded her too much, or not enough. She opened her eyes again, staring into the tea that had long gone cold. The little girl she once knew was still in there somewhere, buried beneath years of anger, resentment, and pain. Irina's chest ached with a sorrow so deep it felt physical. She wasn't just mourning the loss of peace in her home. She was mourning the daughter she once knew, the little girl who used to dance in the kitchen and call her, "Mama," with joy, not rage. Irina wiped away a tear with the edge of her sleeve. She wanted to believe there was still hope, still a way to reach that child within Alina. But every bruise, every cruel word, made that hope feel more like a ghost, visible for a moment, then gone again. The wind howled outside as rain lashed against the windows, streaking the glass with long, angry lines. Inside, the apartment felt colder than usual, though the heater hummed faintly in the corner. Irina sat at the edge of the couch, knitting in silence, each movement of the needle deliberate and slow. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her, both unpredictable, both unforgiving. The front door burst open with a loud crash. Irina jolted, her knitting needles slipping from her fingers and landing on the floor with a soft clatter. Alina staggered in, drenched from head to toe, her wet hair clinging to her face, eyes blazing with fury. The smell of alcohol followed her like a shadow. Her heels clacked hard against the floor as she stormed in, tossing her bag to the ground with careless force. The next morning
didn't
dawned
even
gray
call,
and damp,
she
the
snapped,
storm
her
having
voice
passed
slurred
but
but
leaving
sharp.
behind a chill in the
Did
air.
you think I
in the
wouldn't come
apartment.
back? Or maybe
Irina
you hoped
moved
I
slowly
wouldn't.
as she
Her
tidied
words
up
stung
the
more than the
broken
wind
lamp and
blowing
cleaned
through
the
the
small
still
trail
open
of
door.
dried blood from her lip.
Irina stood up
Her
slowly,
joints ached
her
from
voice
sleeping
barely
on the
above a
couch,
whisper.
too afraid to go
Alina,
near her
you're
room
soaking
where
wet.
Alina had
Let
slammed
me
the
get
door
you a
shut hours
towel.
earlier.
I don't need anything
The
from
bruises
you.
on her arms and
Alina
back
shouted,
throbbed like
stepping
echoes of the night
forward,
before.
her breath hot and bitter with
She
the scent
tried
of
to
vodka.
silence the memory,
Her
to
hand
convince
swung
herself
out,
that it
knocking
wasn't
over
that
the
bad.
lamp on the
She
side
always
table.
did.
It
Around
crashed to the
mid-morning,
floor,
a sharp
plunging
knock
half
at
the
the
room
door
into
broke the
shadow.
silence.
The flickering
Irina
ceiling
froze.
light buzzed,
It wasn't
casting
Alina.
their
She
distorted
was still
reflections on
asleep,
the window.
passed out in her room.
Irina didn't
This
move.
knock was
She
too
stood
firm,
there,
too
trembling
deliberate.
slightly,
Her
her
heart
hands
jumped.
clutching the
She
edge of
walked
her
to the door
sweater.
cautiously,
She looked
glancing
at her
through the
daughter,
peephole.
not with
It was
anger,
Mr.
not even
Pavel,
fear,
the
but with a
neighbor from
kind of
across the
broken-hearted
hall.
sorrow
A
that cut
quiet
deeper
man
than
in his
words.
60s, retired
You
and
don't care
polite,
about me,
always nodded
Alina
when they
hissed,
passed on
pacing
the
like a
stairs.
caged animal.
But now his
You let him
expression was
lead.
different,
You let
serious,
everything fall
concerned.
apart. You
Irina
ruined my
hesitated,
life.
then
Her
slowly
voice
opened
cracked
the
at the
door
last
just enough
word,
to
her
peek
rage
through.
starting to twist into
Good
something
morning,
more desperate.
Irina, he said gently.
Irina took a small step
I heard
forward,
shouting
her
again
voice
last
shaking.
night.
I
And a
tried,
crash.
Alina.
He looked
I did
down,
everything
as
I
if
could for
ashamed to
you.
even bring it
Liar. Alina
Are you all
screamed,
right?
and without
Irina
warning,
forced a
she lunged
smile,
forward.
the kind that
Her
barely
hand
curled the
connected with
edges of her
Irina's
lips.
shoulder, shoving
It
her
was
back.
nothing,
The
Mr.
older woman stumbled, falling
Just
onto
some
the
family
floor with a thud that
disagreements.
echoed through the
Everything's
room.
fine now.
For a
But he
moment,
didn't
there
back
was only
away.
the sound of
His
the rain
eyes
pounding
drifted
the
to
windows and
purple mark
Alina's
just
labored
visible
breathing.
beneath her scarf.
Irina lay there,
Please forgive
staring
me,
up at the
but
ceiling,
this
her
isn't the
body
first
aching not
time.
just from
I
the
hear
fall but
things,
from years
many
of
nights.
emotional blows
You
that
don't
had
have to
worn her
lie.
down to the bone.
Irina's throat tightened.
Her eyes filled
She
with
shook her head
tears,
weakly.
not because of
It's
the
not her
pain,
fault.
but because her
She's
daughter,
going
her little
through
girl,
something.
had become
She
this
didn't mean
angry,
to hurt
broken
me.
stranger.
You're not safe.
A
he
flash of
said,
lightning lit up
softly
the
but
room,
firmly.
and for a
This
second,
has to
the
stop.
shadow of Alina's
Before
figure
Irina
loomed
could
large on the
respond,
wall,
a loud voice rang
monstrous
from
but also
inside the
lost.
apartment.
Alina
Who is
didn't
it?
speak
What are you
again.
doing
She
talking
turned
to
away,
people?
slamming her
Alina
bedroom
stomped
door
into the
behind
living
her.
room, her hair
Irina
disheveled,
remained on the
eyes
floor,
red and puffy.
too exhausted to get up,
Mister,
her tears
Pavel
mixing with
didn't
the faint
flinch.
trickle of
I
blood
just
from her
came
lip.
to check if your mother
The
is all
storm
right.
outside continued
Alina's
to
jaw
rage,
clenched,
but the one
and without a
inside their
word,
home was
she
far
slammed
more
the door in
devastating.
his face. Irina turned to her, pleading gently, Alina, please. He was just being kind. Kind. He wants to call the police, is that it? Alina barked. Do you want to be taken away? Do you want me arrested? No, Irina whispered. Of course not. You're unbelievable, Alina muttered and stormed back into her room. The door slammed again, and Irina stood motionless, heart pounding, guilt and fear choking her all at once. But it was too late, the silence of their suffering had been broken. The outside world knew now. Someone had seen. Someone had heard. Later that evening, when the knock came again, it wasn't Mr. Pavel. It was a young woman with a badge and a clipboard, a social worker. "Good evening, ma'am. We received a report of domestic abuse in this household. May I come in to speak with you?" Irina didn't know what to say. She stood frozen in the doorway. Her mind raced, not with fear of the woman standing before her, but of what Alina would say, and do, if she found out. Still, a tiny voice inside her, buried deep under years of silence, whispered, "Maybe this is the moment everything changes." The hospital room was sterile and pale, its walls an unfeeling white that seemed to drain all warmth from the air. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring every heartbeat and breath, their soft hum the only rhythm in the heavy silence. Irina lay motionless in the hospital bed, her face gaunt, her arms lined with IV tubes and faded bruises. Her chest rose and fell slowly, each breath shallow but steady. She looked more fragile than ever, like a porcelain figure at the edge of shattering. It had happened 2 nights after the social worker's visit. Alina had barely spoken since, pacing the apartment in tight circles, muttering under her breath. Then, without warning, Irina collapsed in the kitchen. Her knees buckled and she hit the floor hard, the cup in her hand shattering into pieces. Alina stood there frozen for a moment, paralyzed, watching her mother groan in pain, unable to lift herself. The ambulance came fast, called by Mr. Pavel. He'd heard the crash again and didn't wait this time. The paramedics had to fight to get answers out of Alina, but Irina had already drifted into unconsciousness before they loaded her into the stretcher. Blood pressure dangerously low, signs of internal bleeding, old fractures, malnutrition. Now, Alina stood in the corner of the hospital room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't touched her phone. She hadn't moved for over an hour. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes kept flicking toward her mother, her breathing shallow with something she couldn't name. Maybe panic, maybe guilt, maybe both. The doctor had been kind but direct. This isn't the first time her body has been injured like this. She's been living with untreated wounds for months, maybe years. Someone's been hurting her, and badly. Alina hadn't answered. She couldn't. Every word would have felt like a confession. She looked at her mother now, not as the weak woman she often screamed at, but as something else entirely. Smaller, fainter, human in a way she'd forgotten to see. Irina's face, even in sleep, was lined with pain, but also peace, like she had finally let go of a burden too long carried. Alina's knees buckled and she slowly sank into the chair beside the bed. For a long time, she stared at Irina's hand, resting limply on the blanket. She reached out, hesitated, then touched it with trembling fingers. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know it had gotten this far. I thought you were stronger than this." "No, that's not true, I just didn't care." Her words hung in the air like smoke, dissolving into silence. She leaned forward and rested her forehead gently against her mother's hand, holding it tighter now. There were no tears yet. Just a quiet, heavy ache growing in her chest. Outside, the rain had started again, a gentle drizzle tapping the windows like distant memories trying to get in. Inside, something shifted in Alina, a soft fracture in the wall she'd built around her heart. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first step toward facing the truth. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first time she truly saw her mother for who she was, not weak. Not silent, but broken from loving too much, and still surviving. The nurse entered the hospital room quietly, holding a small envelope in her hand. Alina sat by the bedside, her head bowed, her hand still loosely holding her mother's. Irina hadn't woken up yet, but her condition had stabilized overnight. The color in her face had begun to return, and the lines of pain on her brow had softened slightly in sleep. It was a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. "Miss," the nurse said softly, not wanting to startle her. "We found this in your mother's coat pocket. We believe she meant to give it to you. It's addressed to you by name." Alina blinked, confused, as she took the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, slanted, and slightly shaky. "To my daughter," it read. Just that. No date. No other details. She held it in her hand for a moment, unsure if she had the right to open it. Guilt wrapped around her like cold steel. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the letter out and unfolded the page. She began to read. "My dearest Alina. If you are reading this, maybe something has changed. Maybe you are hurting. Maybe you are beginning to see the things I could never say out loud. I want to start by saying, I love you. I have always loved you, from the moment you took your first breath in my arms. You were light in a dark time of my life, and I promised myself I would protect you no matter what. But I see now that I may have failed you in ways I didn't understand. Life was never fair to us. Your father left. We had so little. And you carried burdens a child never should have carried. I saw it in your eyes, even when you were small. I wanted to fix it all, but I didn't know how. I made mistakes, I stayed silent, and I watched you grow angry, distant, lost. When you hit me, I didn't see violence, I saw pain. And it broke me, not just from the pain of your hand, but the pain of knowing I couldn't reach the little girl inside you anymore. The one who used to dance with me in the kitchen. The one who asked me to sing until she fell asleep. But I forgive you, Alina. I forgave you the first time. And the second. And every time after that. Not because I'm weak, but because I know what love looks like when it's tired, when it's desperate, when it has nowhere else to go. I forgive you because I still believe in you. I believe there is good in you. And I believe you can heal. You are not your anger. Maybe one day you'll be able to forgive yourself too. With all my love, Mama. Alina sat frozen, the letter shaking slightly in her hands. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop it, the tears came, slow at first, then all at once. She curled forward, her head resting on her mother's blanket, sobbing into it. Not just from guilt, but from grief. Grief for the mother she had pushed away. Grief for the little girl she used to be. Grief for all the years they lost to silence, to violence, to hurt that had no name. Mama, she whispered, voice hoarse, broken. I didn't know. I didn't know you were still loving me through all of it. She read the letter again, clinging to the words like a lifeline, each sentence peeling away a layer of anger she hadn't realized had hardened into armor. For the first time in years, she saw herself not as a victim of life, but as someone who had become the source of pain. And it shattered her. But somewhere in that brokenness, in that deep well of sorrow, a seed of something else took root, remorse, yes, but also something gentler. Something like hope. Something like the faintest beginning of change. 2 weeks had passed since the hospital, and though the physical wounds had begun to heal, the emotional ones were far more delicate, far slower. Irina stepped cautiously through the doorway of her apartment, wrapped in a long wool shawl, her movements deliberate, her body still weak. Her skin was pale, and her eyes looked older, worn not just by age, but by the weight of years lived in silence. The doctor had told her she would need rest, care, and a calm environment. He hadn't said how one heals from a broken heart. The apartment smelled different, clean, almost fresh. It was unfamiliar, and that alone put her on edge. For a moment she feared she had walked into the wrong home. But as her eyes moved across the room, she saw subtle traces, her favorite teacup on the shelf, the old photo of Alina as a toddler on the wall. This was her home. But something had shifted. Alina stepped out of the kitchen, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. Her eyes were tired, rimmed in red, but calmer, gentler. She had pulled her dark hair into a loose bun, and wore a simple sweater and jeans. No makeup, no cold shield, just herself, raw and real. She paused when she saw her mother, swallowing hard as though struggling to keep from saying too much too fast. I made chamomile. You used to drink it at night, she said. Softly. Irina gave a small nod, still unsure. Her steps were slow as she walked toward the couch. Alina set the cups down on the table, where a single red rose lay in a short glass jar. Irina stared at the flower for a long moment, her eyes wet, her mouth pressed into a trembling line. I cleaned the place, Alina added quickly, as if she needed to fill the silence. Got rid of all the broken things. The lamp, the glass. I'm sorry for everything, Mama. The words were simple, but they held a gravity that filled the room. Irina slowly lowered herself into the couch, and Alina sat beside her, close, but not too close. There was still distance between them, a space carved by years of pain. But for the first time, it wasn't filled with fear or shouting. It was filled with stillness. With listening. For a while, they said nothing. The tea sat untouched. The rain tapped lightly against the window again, just like it had that night. But this time, it didn't feel threatening. It felt cleansing. Alina reached out slowly, her hand shaking as it hovered over her mother's. She waited, unsure if she would be allowed to touch. Irina hesitated for just a moment, then turned her hand and gently closed her fingers around her daughter's. No words passed between them. They didn't need to. In that quiet gesture, decades of pain began to melt, not erased, not forgotten, but acknowledged. Irina finally let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. And Alina, for the first time in years, felt the warmth of her mother's hand without shame, without hate, just a fragile, uncertain kind of love. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Wounds that deep don't vanish in a day. But it was a beginning. A fragile rebirth. Two broken women, sitting side by side, holding on, not just to each other, but to the chance that maybe healing was still possible. Maybe, just maybe, the cycle could end.